In the quiet suburbs of Oak Ridge, life seemed picture-perfect for Jonathan and Emily Hartwell. Two outsiders, they were the epitome of a loving couple, with their modern home, weekend getaways, and social media profiles full of happy moments. But behind closed doors, Jonathan harbored a simmering resentment that no one could see, a darkness born from jealousy and the feeling that his wife's ambition overshadowed his own. Emily, radiant and driven, worked long hours at a corporate firm, often returning home exhausted but cheerful, trying to maintain a veneer of marital bliss. Jonathan, however, had grown increasingly paranoid and controlling over the months, questioning her every move, her friends, even her family. Under the guise of concern, the tension in the house grew like a storm cloud, silent but threatening, and Jonathan's obsession with control took a sinister turn. One evening, after Emily had returned from a late work function, he confronted her about an innocuous conversation she had had with a colleague, his anger flaring. Emily tried to calm him, but the conversation escalated into a heated argument, punctuated by threats and bitter accusations. That night, Jonathan lay awake, his mind racing with dark thoughts. He imagined scenarios where he could finally teach her a lesson and eliminate the source of his perceived humiliation. The idea of harming Emily began to crystallize in his mind, not out of passion, but from a cold, calculated desire for power and revenge. He started to research methods online, looking for ways to immobilize her without raising suspicion. Weeks passed, and Jonathan's obsession grew, blending seamlessly with meticulous planning. He purchased supplies under false pretenses, learned about refrigeration temperatures and their effects on the human body, and studied crime forums under anonymous usernames. Meanwhile, Emily remained blissfully unaware of the storm building in her own home, focusing on work and planning a weekend getaway that Jonathan pretended to support. The duality of their lives, her normalcy and his obsessions, set the stage for a chilling sequence of events, where love, trust, and betrayal would collide in ways that no one could have predicted. The tension reached a breaking point one frigid November night when Jonathan executed the first steps of his horrifying plan. He waited until Emily had fallen asleep and then carefully sedated her with a concoction he had learned about online. Once she was unconscious, he wrapped her in layers of blankets and maneuvered her into the basement freezer, which he had prepared meticulously to ensure she could not escape. For 5 days, Jonathan believed he had removed the problem entirely, checking only intermittently to maintain the illusion that she would not survive the ordeal. He went about his life in the daylight hours, pretending to grieve, maintaining conversations with neighbors, and posting happy family images online, all while hiding his monstrous actions below. Meanwhile, Emily, fighting for her life, used instinct and sheer willpower to survive the icy confines of the freezer. Her body slowed almost to the brink of death, but she kept moving slightly, preventing total hypothermia. Each day was a struggle against unconsciousness, fear, and despair. Yet her human resilience proved stronger than Jonathan anticipated. Finally, on the 5th day, Jonathan made a careless mistake, leaving the freezer door slightly ajar as he went about some errands. Emily seized the opportunity, forcing the door open just enough to crawl out. Shivering and disoriented, she navigated the dark basement and escaped into the living area, where she finally confronted the horror of what had happened. Her survival marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that would expose Jonathan's monstrous deeds to the world. The aftermath would involve police investigations, psychological profiling, and a community struggling to understand how a man could plan and execute such a cold-blooded crime, and yet almost flawlessly attempt to conceal it. Emily's courage in surviving sparked national headlines, interviews, and a courtroom drama that captivated audiences worldwide. Jonathan, once seen as the ideal husband, now faced the full weight of justice and public outrage, his meticulous planning undone by one act of survival. Through it all, Emily's resilience became a symbol of human endurance as she began to reclaim her life, piece by piece, from the chilling grasp of betrayal and near-death. The story of Jonathan and Emily Hartwell is a stark reminder that evil can lurk behind the most familiar faces, but also that the human spirit, when fueled by determination, can triumph against even the coldest, darkest intentions. After crawling out of the freezer, Emily Hartwell's body was a fragile shell of what it had been just days before. Her skin burned with frostbite, her limbs refused to obey her commands, and her mind floated between terror, disbelief, and the slow recognition that she had narrowly escaped death. She stumbled toward the living room, clutching herself for warmth, her teeth chattering uncontrollably as the cold continued to seep into her bones, and finally collapsed onto the couch, barely conscious, her mind racing to comprehend the unimaginable betrayal. Jonathan, upstairs, remained oblivious to the miracle that had occurred, confident that his careful plan had succeeded. He busied himself in the kitchen, preparing his alibi, arranging the house to appear untouched, rehearsing the conversations he would have with neighbors, friends, and eventually the authorities, ensuring that every detail aligned with the facade of a grieving husband. Meanwhile, Emily, summoned by sheer survival instinct, forced herself into a liminal state of awareness. Crawling to the phone and dialing the emergency services, her fingers numb and trembling, her voice barely more than a whisper as she tried to convey the incomprehensible truth to the dispatcher. The paramedics arrived quickly, shocked to find a woman who had endured nearly unimaginable conditions yet was still alive, a living testament to the strength of human endurance. They wrapped her in thermal blankets, carefully monitored her vital signs, and transported her to the hospital, all while Emily struggled to comprehend that the person who had caused her suffering remained free within the same house she had just escaped. In the hospital, doctors and nurses worked tirelessly to stabilize her condition, treating frostbite, dehydration, and the early stages of hypothermia, while psychologists and detectives began to piece together the narrative of what had transpired, interviewing Emily between sedated intervals to collect as much information as possible. The forensic evidence, including temperature logs, traces of sedatives, and other subtle clues Jonathan had left behind, began to paint a chilling portrait of premeditated murder. Each element a testament to Jonathan's meticulous planning and his delusional belief that he could control both life and death. Emily, grappling with the trauma, found herself oscillating between despair and a growing determination to survive, not just physically, but emotionally. Realizing that her survival itself could serve as both proof and justice, a way to expose the man who had attempted to erase her existence. News of the incident spread quickly, capturing national attention as the details emerged. A woman held captive in a freezer for 5 days, surviving against overwhelming odds. And the husband, once respected in the community, now under suspicion of attempted murder. Investigators painstakingly examined the Hartwell residence, documenting evidence that ranged from the precise method of sedative administration to the careful manipulation of household appliances, revealing the extent of Jonathan's obsession and the cold, calculated nature of his crime. Media coverage focused on Emily's miraculous survival, her harrowing experience becoming both a human interest story and a cautionary tale, drawing attention to the darker realities of domestic abuse, manipulation, and premeditated violence that often go unnoticed behind closed doors. As Emily recovered physically, the psychological scars remained, haunting her dreams and waking moments, but they also fueled a desire for justice, a drive to ensure that Jonathan would face the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, Jonathan, confronted by mounting suspicion, struggled to maintain composure, his confidence eroding as inconsistencies in his story and mounting evidence made it increasingly impossible to sustain the charade of innocence. Interviews with neighbors, friends, and co-workers revealed subtle warning signs that had previously been dismissed, moments of controlling behavior, unexplained absences, and a pattern of jealousy and manipulation that, in hindsight, painted a disturbing portrait of a man capable of extreme measures. Emily's family, grappling with shock, fear, and a complex mix of anger and relief, rallied around her, providing the emotional and logistical support necessary to navigate legal proceedings and the painstaking process of reclaiming a sense of safety and normalcy. The police, working alongside forensic psychologists, began to construct a timeline of the crime, carefully reconstructing each step Jonathan had taken from the initial planning through the procurement of materials to the execution of his horrific plan and the eventual mistake that allowed Emily to survive. Court preparation began, with lawyers and investigators ensuring that every piece of evidence, testimony, and psychological analysis was meticulously documented, anticipating the inevitable legal battle that would seek to determine accountability, culpability, and the boundaries of human depravity. Emily, despite her trauma, found moments of resilience and clarity, understanding that survival was just the first step in a long journey toward justice, healing, and reclaiming control over her own life. Her narrative became a beacon of hope for others who might face similar danger, demonstrating that even in the most dire circumstances, courage and determination can prevail. As the investigation deepened, psychological profiles of Jonathan painted him as a man consumed by envy, control, and a desire to dominate, his outwardly normal facade masking an inner darkness that escalated to attempted murder, challenging assumptions about how evil can manifest in everyday life and prompting a broader conversation about warning signs, mental health, and the importance of vigilance in domestic settings. The chapter closed with Emily still in the hospital, her body weak but her spirit unbroken, and Jonathan under increasing scrutiny, the intricate web of lies beginning to unravel, setting the stage for an intense confrontation with law enforcement, the media, and ultimately the courtroom, where the full scope of his actions would be exposed to the world. The contrast between Emily's resilience and Jonathan's unraveling psyche underscored the chilling reality that evil often hides behind familiar faces. But truth and survival have a way of bringing darkness to light, proving that even the most carefully executed plans of malice can be thwarted by courage, instinct, and the human will to live. As Emily Hartwell began to regain her strength, the weight of what had happened pressed on her mind with unrelenting intensity. But she also knew that her survival alone would not be enough to bring Jonathan to justice. The law required evidence, witness testimony, and a meticulous reconstruction of events to prove premeditation and intent. Detectives from the Oak Ridge Police Department arrived at the Hartwell residence early one morning. Their approach, professional but cautious, understanding that they were entering the scene of a crime that was both horrifying and rare in its calculated cruelty. They started with a thorough walkthrough of the house, documenting every detail: the freezer in the basement, which had been cleaned and modified to maximize containment, the remnants of sedatives Jonathan had used to incapacitate Emily, his carefully maintained alibi notes, and the subtle signs of a struggle that he had assumed would remain invisible. Forensic teams collected fingerprints, DNA traces, and environmental data, building a comprehensive timeline of Jonathan's movements and actions during the fateful 5 days. Emily, though still weak, provided detailed accounts of her captivity, recalling small but crucial details: the exact position of the blankets, the sounds she heard in the basement, and the mistakes Jonathan made in underestimating her will to survive. Each recollection was a piece of the puzzle, and detectives recorded her statements with meticulous precision, aware that any gaps could be exploited in court. Meanwhile, Jonathan was summoned for questioning, his confident demeanor beginning to crack under subtle but pointed inquiries. Investigators used psychological techniques to detect inconsistencies, noting the tension in his voice, the hesitations in his speech, and the subtle attempts to deflect responsibility onto Emily, which only further incriminated him. News outlets began reporting on the unfolding investigation, sensationalizing aspects of the case while simultaneously raising awareness about the dangers of domestic violence and premeditated attacks. Emily became a reluctant figure in the media, her courage highlighted, but her privacy increasingly invaded by reporters seeking every detail of her ordeal. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered digital evidence, search histories, forum posts, and purchase records that revealed Jonathan's planning and research, each entry demonstrating the cold calculation behind his actions and the deliberate nature of his attempts to conceal the crime. Interviews with friends, co-workers, and family members painted a complex portrait of Jonathan, charismatic and charming in public, yet increasingly controlling, obsessive, and unpredictable in private. Subtle patterns of manipulation and coercion emerged, showing that the seeds of his violent tendencies had been present long before the freezer incident. Emily's medical records further corroborated her story, showing the physiological effects of extreme hypothermia and sedation, providing undeniable proof that she had been subjected to life-threatening conditions, intentionally imposed by another person. Legal experts began to prepare for the possibility of a high-profile trial, outlining charges that included attempted murder, assault with intent to kill, and premeditated abuse. Each piece of evidence strengthened the case, while also highlighting the horrifying reality of how ordinary domestic disputes could escalate to extreme violence. The detectives, working closely with forensic psychologists, constructed a profile of Jonathan's behavior, revealing obsessive tendencies, narcissism, and an inability to tolerate perceived humiliation, all of which had contributed to the development and execution of the crime. Emily, while processing her trauma, began to understand the importance of her testimony, recognizing that recounting her ordeal in painstaking detail would be essential to ensuring that justice was served and that Jonathan could no longer harm anyone else. The investigation also uncovered alarming patterns in Jonathan's past, including instances of manipulative behavior, controlling tendencies, and subtle forms of abuse that had previously gone unnoticed, suggesting a long history of escalating aggression that culminated in his attempt to kill his wife. As the case gained national attention, the community of Oak Ridge grappled with shock, disbelief, and fear, realizing that the seemingly idyllic neighborhood had harbored a dark secret, and that appearances could be dangerously deceptive. Meanwhile, Emily's family worked to support her through medical appointments, legal meetings, and media interactions, ensuring that she had both emotional and logistical support while navigating the complexities of trauma recovery and a legal investigation. Jonathan, increasingly isolated and under scrutiny, found himself confronted with the consequences of his actions, his meticulous planning unraveling as each new discovery by investigators chipped away at the narrative of innocence he had tried to construct. The chapter closed with Emily sitting quietly in a hospital room, surrounded by notes, evidence, photos, and interview recordings, understanding that the fight was far from over, but resolute in her determination to see the man who had tried to end her life held accountable. The investigation was no longer just a police operation. It had become a testament to her survival, a careful orchestration of law, evidence, and human courage, ensuring that the truth, no matter how chilling, would eventually be revealed in full, and that Jonathan's darkness would no longer remain hidden behind a mask of normalcy. As the investigation intensified, Jonathan Hartwell's carefully constructed world began to collapse around him. The confident mask he had worn in public slipping under the relentless pressure of law enforcement scrutiny, media attention, and mounting evidence that left little room for denial. Friends and neighbors who had once praised him for his charm and professionalism now exchanged uneasy glances, noticing subtle signs of stress, irritability, and obsessive behavior that had previously been dismissed as normal quirks. Inside the Hartwell residence, the tension was palpable, with investigators returning repeatedly to document overlooked details, freezer temperature logs, the minute traces of sedatives on household surfaces, and inconsistencies in Jonathan's timeline that directly contradicted Emily's account. Jonathan, aware that each discovery further incriminated him, oscillated between attempts to manipulate those around him and moments of near realizing that the meticulous plan he had spent months devising was unraveling faster than he could control. Social media played a pivotal role in the public's perception, as photos of Emily's miraculous survival circulated alongside headlines emphasizing the chilling nature of the crime, generating widespread outrage and fascination. For Jonathan, this public scrutiny added an unbearable weight, stripping away the anonymity he had relied on to maintain his facade. Friends and colleagues, who once considered him trustworthy, now hesitated to speak to him, sensing an underlying menace. While law enforcement officers leveraged witness accounts to paint a broader picture of his manipulative tendencies, revealing a pattern of controlling behavior, jealousy, and obsessive surveillance that had escalated dangerously over time. Emily, slowly regaining strength, began to contribute actively to the investigation, providing detailed recollections of her captivity. From Jonathan's careful methods of sedation to the moments she had nearly given up hope, her testimony became a linchpin in the case, demonstrating not only her survival instinct but also the calculated cruelty of Jonathan's actions. Forensic psychologists analyzing Jonathan's behavior described him as a man driven by a need for control, a fear of humiliation, and a deep-seated envy that manifested in increasingly erratic and dangerous actions, concluding that his outwardly normal demeanor masked a volatile inner world capable of extreme violence. As prosecutors prepared the case, the evidence against Jonathan became nearly irrefutable. Physical traces, digital footprints, eyewitness accounts, and Emily's own harrowing testimony converged to demonstrate premeditation, intent, and a deliberate attempt to conceal the crime, leaving his defense team scrambling to construct any plausible narrative of innocence. The courtroom loomed as the next arena for confrontation, but before the trial began, Jonathan's relationships began to fracture. Family members expressed shock and dismay, struggling to reconcile the image of the man they knew with the person capable of attempting to murder his wife, while neighbors distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with someone under such intense public scrutiny. Meanwhile, Emily's resilience continued to shine, her recovery slow but steady, as she navigated medical treatment, therapy sessions, and legal preparations with a growing sense of empowerment. She began to recognize that her survival was not only a personal triumph, but also a critical piece in ensuring justice was served. The psychological toll on Jonathan was evident in every interaction. His attempts to charm, deceive, or manipulate met with suspicion and growing hostility, highlighting the stark contrast between his outward persona and the monstrous reality of his actions. Even minor missteps in interviews or casual conversations were scrutinized and used to further build the case against him. In the broader community, the case sparked discussions about domestic abuse, the warning signs of obsessive or controlling behavior, and the critical importance of early intervention as neighbors, friends, and family reflected on how the signs had been missed or ignored, emphasizing the chilling reality that even seemingly ordinary households can conceal deadly intentions. Investigators also uncovered evidence of prior planning that extended beyond the freezer incident, including notes, online research, and potential practice runs, which further illustrated Jonathan's meticulous and calculated mindset, underscoring the premeditated nature of his crime and his obsession with eliminating perceived threats to his control. As the media coverage intensified, Jonathan's public image eroded completely, with editorials, interviews, and expert commentary dissecting his personality, his motives, and the horrifying sequence of events, portraying him as both cunning and dangerous, a man whose obsession with control had escalated into a near-fatal act. Emily, bolstered by family support and the determination to see justice done, prepared for the emotional and psychological challenges of testifying. understanding that recounting every detail would be essential to ensuring accountability and preventing Jonathan from harming anyone else. The chapter closed with Jonathan alone in his study, the house eerily quiet, surrounded by evidence of his own planning, confronting the reality that the world now knew the truth. His facade of normalcy shattered. He faced the inevitability of exposure, arrest, and prosecution, while Emily's courage, resilience, and survival became the symbol of triumph over calculated evil. The contrast between her emergence from near death and Jonathan's crumbling facade set the stage for a courtroom confrontation that would reveal the chilling depths of human malice, the meticulous planning behind it, and the enduring power of survival, courage, and truth to bring darkness to light. With the investigation revealing overwhelming evidence of premeditation and intent, the legal machinery swung into motion, preparing for what would become a high-profile courtroom battle that captured national attention. As prosecutors meticulously compiled forensic data, Emily's detailed testimony, and digital records illustrating Jonathan Hartwell's obsessive planning, while defense attorneys scrambled to identify loopholes, question credibility, and construct any narrative that might mitigate his culpability. The grand jury convened, sifting through reams of evidence and witness statements, and ultimately indicted Jonathan on charges including attempted murder, assault with intent to kill, and unlawful imprisonment, signaling the beginning of a legal struggle that would test the limits of forensic science, psychological profiling, and courtroom strategy. Emily, though still recovering physically and emotionally, began attending preparatory sessions with prosecutors and victim advocates, learning how to recount her ordeal with precision, control, and clarity, understanding that her testimony would not only serve justice, but also highlight the chilling warning signs of domestic abuse and premeditated violence. Meanwhile, Jonathan maintained a defiant front publicly, asserting innocence and attempting to sway public opinion through selective statements to the media. But the mounting evidence and expert analyses of his psychological profile painted a narrative that he could not escape, a man consumed by envy, control, and a calculated desire to dominate, whose outward charm concealed the capacity for extreme violence. The courtroom became a stage where the terrifying details of the crime unfolded, with investigators presenting forensic evidence, photographs of the freezer and basement, and Emily's harrowing recollections of the 5 days she spent trapped in freezing darkness, her voice steady despite the weight of reliving the trauma. Psychologists and criminal behavior experts provided testimony on Jonathan's obsessive tendencies, his pattern of manipulation, and his calculated approach to incapacitating and attempting to kill his wife, reinforcing the prosecution's assertion that the crime was methodical and premeditated, not a spontaneous act of passion or mistake. During cross-examination, defense attorneys attempted to challenge Emily's recollections, suggesting that memory might be unreliable under extreme stress. But the corroborating physical evidence, digital footprints, and expert testimony left little room for doubt, illustrating the precision with which Jonathan had planned and executed his attempt on her life. As the trial progressed, media coverage, with journalists dissecting every nuance of testimony, behavioral analysis, and courtroom drama, while public opinion largely sided with Emily, inspired by her courage, survival, and composure. further isolating Jonathan and undermining any perception of credibility or innocence he had hoped to maintain. The prosecution also highlighted Jonathan's meticulous preparation, including his study of sedation techniques, freezer temperatures, and the timing of his actions, all of which illustrated that the attempt to kill Emily was deliberate, calculated, and cold-blooded, executed with precision rather than in a moment of uncontrolled rage. Emily's resilience became a recurring theme in media coverage, interviews, and courtroom narratives, portraying her not merely as a victim but as a symbol of human endurance, determination, and the ability to confront unimaginable terror while contributing actively to justice. Simultaneously, legal experts debated the nuances of the case, examining the intersections of domestic violence, premeditated murder attempts, psychological manipulation, and the evidentiary thresholds required for conviction, revealing the complex layers of the criminal justice system and the challenges inherent in prosecuting calculated acts of violence within intimate relationships. Jonathan, increasingly isolated and facing public vilification, began to show cracks in his composure, his defense team struggling to counter the overwhelming evidence, inconsistencies in his statements, and expert analyses of his behavior, all of which painted a portrait of a man whose desire for control had escalated into an almost fatal obsession. Outside the courtroom, community members grappled with shock, fear, and reflection, reconsidering their assumptions about trust, appearances, and the hidden darkness that could exist behind closed doors, sparking conversations about vigilance, mental health, and the importance of addressing subtle signs of controlling behavior before escalation occurs. Emily's family continued to provide steadfast support, ensuring she had emotional, psychological, and logistical backing as she prepared to testify in full, knowing that her recollections would be pivotal in securing accountability, preventing further harm, and reinforcing the message that survival is a critical form of resistance against cruelty. The chapter closed with the courtroom poised for the next round of testimony, Jonathan sitting stoically but internally unraveling, his carefully constructed persona eroded by each revelation, each expert analysis, and each harrowing detail recounted by Emily, while the prosecution, empowered by a combination of physical evidence, digital footprints, and psychological profiling, readied themselves to deliver a compelling narrative of intent, obsession, and near-fatal consequences. The stage was set for a confrontation not just between a husband and wife, but between meticulous criminal planning and indomitable human resilience, with the ultimate question hanging over the court: could Jonathan's cold-blooded attempt to erase a life be fully undone by the courage, evidence, and truth that Emily embodied? And would justice finally prevail against a man whose obsession had almost claimed the life of someone he supposedly loved? As the trial progressed, the psychological weight of the events took a profound toll on both Emily Hartwell and Jonathan, albeit in dramatically different ways, highlighting the contrasting paths of victimhood. Emily, still physically recovering from frostbite and prolonged hypothermia, found herself navigating recurring nightmares, flashbacks, and anxiety attacks that emerged unexpectedly, triggered by everyday sounds, shadows, or even the cold, which reminded her of the 5 harrowing days she had spent trapped in the freezer. Despite the trauma, she remained steadfast in her commitment to justice, attending therapy sessions, speaking with legal advisors, and practicing recounting her experience to ensure clarity, accuracy, and emotional composure while testifying in court. Recognizing that her survival was not only a personal triumph, but also a tool for accountability. Jonathan, on the other hand, faced a slowly unraveling psyche as his carefully curated image disintegrated under public scrutiny and legal exposure. The once scum and controlling man became increasingly volatile, oscillating between denial, anger, and desperate attempts to maintain control over a narrative that was rapidly slipping beyond his grasp. Psychologists called to testify described Jonathan as exhibiting classic signs of obsessive-compulsive and narcissistic tendencies, emphasizing his need for dominance, control, and manipulation, while also noting his inability to process humiliation or failure in socially acceptable ways, which likely contributed to the extreme measures he took against his wife. Courtroom observers, jurors, and the media noted the stark contrast between Emily's composed testimony and Jonathan's increasingly erratic demeanor, a juxtaposition that underscored the human capacity for resilience in the face of deliberate harm and the fragility of a criminal mind. When confronted with irrefutable evidence and public exposure, Emily's daily life outside the courtroom was carefully structured to accommodate her recovery, while allowing her to participate in the ongoing legal process. Her days included physical therapy to restore strength, counseling to address post-traumatic stress, and meticulous preparation for courtroom appearances, all of which demanded extraordinary mental and emotional energy, reflecting her determination to reclaim autonomy over her life. Meanwhile, Jonathan's attempts at psychological manipulation extended into interactions with his legal team and acquaintances, seeking to shift blame, minimize his actions, or sow doubt. But these tactics often backfired, as investigators and prosecutors carefully documented inconsistencies, contradictions, and admissions, gradually painting a comprehensive picture of premeditated intent. The media coverage amplified the psychological pressure, as each new revelation about Jonathan's planning, behavior, and motives circulated widely, fostering public outrage and increasing the emotional stakes of the trial for both parties. Emily, though exposed to public attention, drew strength from the support of her family, friends, and broader advocacy groups that emphasized survivor empowerment and accountability. As expert testimony delved into Jonathan's mental state, forensic psychologists explained the concept of cognitive distortion, in which he likely rationalized his actions as justifiable within his own mind, illustrating how obsessive control and narcissistic traits can lead to extreme acts of violence, while still maintaining an outwardly normal facade. A chilling insight into how seemingly ordinary individuals can commit extraordinary crimes. Emily's resilience became central to the narrative, not only in court, but also in broader discussions about domestic abuse, manipulation, and psychological trauma. With her ability to recount events with clarity and emotional strength serving as both evidence and inspiration, demonstrating the human capacity to endure and confront unimaginable adversity. The contrast between Emily's post-traumatic growth and Jonathan's escalating anxiety highlighted the divergent psychological trajectories of victim and perpetrator, with Emily reclaiming agency and building a support network, while Jonathan confronted the collapse of his meticulously controlled world. Increasingly isolated, mistrusted, and scrutinized from every angle. Each day in court brought new challenges. Emily confronted graphic descriptions, relived moments of terror, and faced cross-examination designed to test memory, credibility, and composure. Yet she remained remarkably steady, her resolve strengthened by a sense of moral duty, personal survival, and the desire to prevent others from falling victim to similar, calculated abuse. Jonathan's mental state deteriorated further as evidence was presented, including digital searches, shopping records for sedatives, and forum posts discussing methods to incapacitate a spouse, which collectively illustrated premeditation beyond reasonable doubt. His defensive strategies, once reliant on charm and rationalization, faltered under the weight of methodical forensic documentation and expert interpretation of his behavior. Outside the courtroom, Emily's family and support team navigated the emotional complexities of witnessing the proceedings, balancing outrage, empathy, and hope, while also protecting Emily from further trauma, ensuring that her voice remained central to the case without being overwhelmed by media attention or public speculation. The chapter closed with a poignant moment in which Emily, despite lingering fear and psychological strain, recognized the power of her survival and testimony as tools to enforce accountability, while Jonathan, alone in his cell or private chambers, confronted the stark reality that his calculated obsession had not only failed to eliminate his wife, but had also laid bare his darkest intentions for the world to see, marking the beginning of a reckoning that would extend far beyond the courtroom and into the public consciousness, forever altering the lives of all involved. The psychological toll, meticulously documented and observed, underscored the profound human consequences of premeditated domestic violence, illustrating both the capacity for resilience in survivors and the ultimate fragility of perpetrators when confronted with truth, evidence, and societal condemnation. As news of Jonathan Hartwell's crime and Emily's miraculous survival spread, the Oak Ridge community struggled to reconcile the shocking events with the seemingly ordinary lives they had observed daily, forcing neighbors, friends, and colleagues to confront unsettling truths about appearances, trust, and hidden violence. What had once seemed like an idyllic suburban neighborhood now became a site of fear, gossip, and heightened awareness, as people realized that the smiling husband and his accomplished wife were living in a reality far darker than anyone had imagined. Local media coverage intensified, broadcasting interviews with shocked neighbors, friends, and family members, each recounting subtle signs of tension, controlling behavior, and unusual arguments. In hindsight, were ominous warnings, creating a collective reflection on human behavior and the sometimes invisible precursors to extreme domestic violence. Community members organized meetings, support groups, and awareness campaigns, seeking to understand the warning signs of obsessive and controlling behavior, promote mental health resources, and foster safe environments for those who might be vulnerable to similar acts, while simultaneously grappling with the shock that such a calculated crime could occur in their midst. Emily's story became a touchstone for discussions about resilience, courage, and survival, inspiring educational programs and local initiatives aimed at empowering individuals to recognize and respond to dangerous situations in relationships, particularly when subtle manipulation escalates to outright violence. Meanwhile, Jonathan faced social isolation beyond the legal consequences he was encountering. Friends who had once trusted him began severing ties. Workplaces and social clubs distanced themselves, and even casual acquaintances expressed caution or outright fear, revealing the rapid erosion of his social capital and the profound impact of public knowledge on his life. Local authorities and advocacy groups collaborated to provide counseling and support not only for Emily but also for others in the community affected by the crime. Recognizing that witnessing such an extreme act of domestic violence could trigger anxiety, trauma, and fear even in those who were physically unharmed. Reflecting the broader societal repercussions of individual criminal acts. The media, while sensational at times, also highlighted Emily's resilience, her active role in the investigation, and her commitment to justice, portraying her as a symbol of hope and endurance in the face of unimaginable adversity. While Jonathan's calculated planning and eventual failure were dissected as both a cautionary tale and a psychological study in obsessive control and domestic extremism, schools, workplaces, and local organizations held workshops on recognizing coercive behavior, warning signs of abuse, and strategies for seeking help safely, emphasizing that extreme acts of violence often follow patterns of manipulation, isolation, and obsessive control that can be detected and addressed before escalation occurs. Community members, while still reeling from shock, began reflecting on their own relationships and environments, fostering conversations about accountability, communication, and vigilance, realizing that safety is a collective responsibility and that even the most seemingly normal households may conceal dangerous dynamics. Emily's family and friends became central figures in outreach efforts, sharing experiences, advocating for survivors, and helping local organizations understand the emotional and logistical needs of those who endure premeditated attacks, while also supporting Emily as she navigated ongoing legal proceedings and personal recovery. Jonathan's actions prompted widespread reflection on the intersection of mental health, criminal intent, and domestic relationships, as experts weighed in on warning signs, prevention strategies, and the importance of addressing obsessive or controlling behavior early, aiming to prevent future tragedies and provide resources for those at risk. The courtroom proceedings continued to serve as a focal point for public engagement, with community members attending hearings, following updates, and discussing the implications of each testimony, evidence, revelation, and expert analysis, deepening public understanding of the meticulous planning, psychological manipulation, and near-fatal consequences of Jonathan's crime. Through all of this, Emily remained a steady presence, her focus on survival, justice, and advocacy providing an anchor not only for herself but for the broader community grappling with fear, shock, and the need to process what had happened. Her courage inspired local programs, awareness campaigns, and individual reflections that emphasized resilience, vigilance, and empowerment. As Jonathan faced mounting legal, social, and personal consequences, the contrast between his unraveling control and the community's collective support for Emily highlighted the power of societal awareness, solidarity, and moral outrage in responding to acts of extreme domestic violence, reinforcing the idea that crime does not occur in isolation but reverberates through families, neighborhoods, and entire communities. The chapter concluded with Oak Ridge slowly adapting to a new reality, balancing grief, fear, and heightened vigilance with initiatives to foster awareness, safety, and support, while Emily continued her journey of recovery, advocacy, and testimony, embodying the enduring power of resilience in the face of deliberate, calculated evil and underscoring the profound impact one survivor's courage can have on an entire community. As the courtroom proceedings entered their most intense phase, the tension surrounding Jonathan Hartwell's case escalated, with every piece of evidence, testimony, and expert analysis scrutinized under the relentless gaze of judges, jurors, and the public, making it clear that this trial would not only determine the fate of a single man, but also serve as a landmark case in understanding the psychology of premeditated domestic violence. The courtroom was charged with palpable energy, reporters lining the gallery, cameras capturing every reaction, and a community watching anxiously as the chilling narrative unfolded in painstaking detail. Emily, despite her ongoing physical and psychological recovery, took the stand, repeatedly recounting each agonizing moment of her 5 days trapped in the freezer with precision and composure, emphasizing not just the physical torment she endured, but the calculated cruelty and obsessive intent demonstrated by Jonathan, who sat in the defendant's chair, visibly strained, yet attempting to maintain a stoic facade. Expert witnesses, including forensic psychologists, domestic violence specialists, and medical professionals, presented meticulously detailed reports illustrating the extent of Jonathan's planning, from digital searches on sedation methods to the deliberate manipulation of household appliances, demonstrating that every step of his crime had been intentional, calculated, and designed to maximize control and harm. Cross-examinations brought moments of tension and drama, as defense attorneys attempted to cast doubt on Emily's recollection, questioning the accuracy of memory under extreme stress, suggesting that circumstantial evidence might be misinterpreted, and probing her emotional state. But the consistency of her testimony, combined with forensic proof and expert analyses, left little room for ambiguity, reinforcing the prosecution's narrative of deliberate intent. The courtroom audience could sense the escalating psychological pressure on Jonathan. Small gestures, fleeting expressions of anxiety, and occasional fumbles in his responses betrayed the carefully constructed image of control he had maintained, highlighting the stark contrast between the calculated mind that had orchestrated the crime and the vulnerable, unraveling individual facing accountability. Outside the courtroom, media coverage reached a fever pitch, with news segments dissecting minute details of the trial, social media posts sharing Emily's story and photographs of courtroom proceedings, and commentary from legal and psychological experts examining the implications of obsessive control, narcissism, and domestic violence in seemingly ordinary households. Emily's family continued to provide unwavering support, ensuring she was emotionally fortified for each day of testimony, while therapists and victim advocates helped her process the trauma, manage flashbacks, and maintain resilience in the face of the courtroom's intense scrutiny, emphasizing that her presence and testimony were crucial both legally and symbolically. Meanwhile, Jonathan's legal team faced mounting challenges as the evidence became increasingly irrefutable. Digital timestamps, purchase records of sedatives, freezer modifications, and Emily's detailed, corroborated recollections collectively painted a picture of premeditated intent, making the defense's argument of innocence or diminished responsibility increasingly tenuous. The prosecution leveraged psychological profiling to explain Jonathan's behavior, illustrating patterns of obsession, control, and extreme manipulation, and connecting these traits directly to the steps he took to incapacitate and nearly kill his wife, highlighting the convergence of personality, pathology, and criminal action. Jurors, deeply engaged, reacted to the emotional and factual weight of the testimony, absorbing both the harrowing account of Emily's survival and the methodical nature of Jonathan's planning, recognizing the calculated and deliberate nature of his actions and noting the stark contrast between a survivor's resilience and a perpetrator's unraveling control. Community members, who had followed the case from the outset, remained highly invested, attending public hearings, following news updates, and discussing the trial's implications on forums, social media, and in local gatherings, creating a broader dialogue about warning signs of domestic abuse, obsessive behavior, and premeditated violence, and how society might better protect potential victims in the future. The trial also illuminated the challenges victims face when confronting perpetrators in court, including emotional strain, memory recall under duress, and public exposure, underscoring the courage required to testify repeatedly against someone who had nearly taken her life, and highlighting the importance of advocacy, preparation, and psychological support. Each day of testimony, evidence, presentation, and expert analysis brought the courtroom closer to an inescapable conclusion, emphasizing the meticulous planning of Jonathan's crime, his obsessive control, and his belief that he could escape consequences, all juxtaposed with Emily's resilience, courage, and active role in pursuing justice. The chapter closed with a tense moment in which Emily, finishing a particularly detailed recounting of her ordeal, looked directly at Jonathan, her composure unwavering, while he visibly faltered, the realization of exposure and accountability weighing heavily, signaling that the psychological and evidentiary momentum of the trial had shifted decisively in favor of truth, justice, and the resilience of a survivor confronting calculated evil. As the trial of Jonathan Hartwell drew to its climax, the courtroom and public alike were gripped by anticipation. With the final arguments, closing statements, and jurors' deliberations looming as the ultimate test of justice, morality, and accountability in one of the most chilling domestic violence cases in recent memory, Emily Hartwell, though exhausted from weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and emotional strain, remained resolute, understanding that her survival and courage were instrumental in exposing Jonathan's calculated attempt to end her life, and that the verdict would not only determine his fate, but also symbolize the triumph of resilience over premeditated evil. Prosecutors delivered closing arguments with meticulous precision, recounting the timeline of Jonathan's obsessive planning, from online research into sedatives and freezer temperatures to the calculated execution of his attempt to incapacitate Emily, emphasizing the deliberate nature of each action, the risk to her life, and the moral culpability inherent in premeditated harm. The defense, in their final appeal, sought to introduce doubt, questioning whether Emily's recollection could be fully accurate under extreme trauma, suggesting that circumstantial evidence might be misinterpreted, and attempting to frame Jonathan's actions as an impulsive lapse rather than a cold-blooded plan. However, the overwhelming weight of physical evidence, forensic analysis, and expert psychological testimony rendered these arguments increasingly tenuous. Jurors, having spent days absorbing harrowing testimony, forensic reports, and expert analyses of Jonathan's behavior, deliberated intensely, aware that their decision carried profound consequences not only for the individuals involved but also for societal understanding of domestic violence, obsession, and premeditated criminal acts. Outside the courtroom, media coverage captured every development, broadcasting updates, interviewing community members, and dissecting the implications of the trial. While social media erupted with discussions, public support for Emily, and debates about the nature of psychological manipulation and domestic abuse, reflecting the case's resonance far beyond Oak Ridge, Emily, despite fatigue and lingering trauma, maintained composure, attending court sessions with careful preparation, relying on her family, therapists, and advocates for support, and recognizing that her role in the proceedings was critical to ensuring that justice would be served, and that Jonathan could not escape accountability. Psychological experts testified on the patterns of obsessive control, narcissistic traits, and cognitive distortions that motivated Jonathan, demonstrating that his actions were neither spontaneous nor the result of temporary stress, but instead a calculated manifestation of a dangerous personality profile, further reinforcing the prosecution's assertion of premeditated intent. The defense struggled to counter the mounting evidence, particularly Emily's detailed recollection of her captivity, the physical evidence corroborating her experience, and the digital footprint documenting Jonathan's research and preparation, which collectively painted a chilling portrait of deliberate, methodical planning aimed at ending the life of someone he purportedly loved. Within the community, the case prompted reflection, discussion, and activism as neighbors, friends, and local organizations grappled with the unsettling reality that domestic abuse could escalate to extreme violence, emphasizing the importance of awareness, prevention, and support structures to protect potential victims. Emily's resilience became a symbol for survivors nationwide, demonstrating the intersection of courage, preparation, and justice in confronting perpetrators. And her story inspired advocacy campaigns, educational programs, and media coverage focused on understanding warning signs, patterns of control, and strategies for escaping dangerous situations. As the jurors continued deliberations, tension in the courtroom was almost tangible, with each passing hour amplifying the anticipation and psychological pressure on both Jonathan and Emily, who knew that the verdict would determine whether months of planning, fear, and survival would culminate in justice, or if the criminal act would somehow escape full accountability. Jonathan, increasingly aware of the strength of the case against him and the unwavering composure of his wife, displayed signs of psychological strain, including restlessness, muttered comments to his legal team, and fleeting expressions of panic, highlighting the contrast between his unraveling control and Emily's steadfast resilience. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity to all involved, the jury returned to deliver their decision. The courtroom fell silent, every eye fixed on the foreperson as they read the verdict aloud, affirming that Jonathan Hartwell was guilty of attempted murder, unlawful imprisonment, and all associated charges, bringing relief to Emily, her family, and the broader community, while serving as a stark condemnation of obsessive, calculated domestic violence. The chapter closed with a complex mix of emotions. Emily, exhausted but vindicated, understanding that survival, courage, and truth had prevailed. Jonathan, confronting the reality of legal and social consequences, his meticulously constructed life shattered, and the Oak Ridge community, reflecting on lessons learned about vigilance, empathy, and the hidden dangers that can exist behind seemingly ordinary facades, all marking the near conclusion of a harrowing journey that intertwined obsession, betrayal, survival, and justice in ways that would resonate far beyond the courtroom walls. With the verdict delivered and Jonathan Hartwell found guilty of attempted murder and unlawful imprisonment, the town of Oak Ridge slowly began to process the full impact of the chilling events that had unfolded. While Emily Hartwell faced the complex and delicate journey of reclaiming her life from trauma, betrayal, and the shadow of the courtroom drama, media attention, and community shock were behind her. Yet the psychological, emotional, and social ramifications continued to shape each day, requiring careful navigation, therapy, and the support of family, friends, and advocates committed to ensuring her continued safety and empowerment. Emily, now recognized widely as a survivor and symbol of resilience, focused on physical recovery from frostbite, weakened muscles, and lingering effects of hypothermia, while simultaneously confronting post-traumatic stress through intensive counseling, support groups, and structured routines designed to gradually restore a sense of normalcy and control over her own life. Meanwhile, Jonathan began serving his sentence, isolated from the community he had once manipulated and deceived, facing not only the legal consequences of his actions, but also the social ostracization, psychological evaluation, and ongoing scrutiny from media and criminologists seeking to understand the depths of premeditated domestic violence, obsessive control, and the calculated measures he had employed to nearly end his wife's life. For Emily, reclaiming her home and personal spaces required confronting memories tied to the freezer, the basement, and the many objects associated with her captivity. Each step toward normalization was an act of courage, reflecting both her personal resilience and the broader symbolism of survival against extreme odds. Her story inspired discussions, articles, and interviews focused on domestic abuse prevention, survivor empowerment, and recognizing early warning signs, highlighting how calculated acts of cruelty often follow identifiable patterns of obsession, jealousy, and controlling behavior that can escalate to life-threatening violence if left unchecked. The Oak Ridge community, while still grappling with shock and disbelief, gradually transitioned into reflection and activism, initiating local campaigns, educational seminars, and support networks to provide resources for victims of domestic violence, emphasizing the need for vigilance, awareness, and proactive intervention in potentially dangerous domestic situations. Emily's family and close friends remained central pillars of support, helping her navigate legal, emotional, and social challenges while also ensuring that media attention did not overwhelm or re-traumatize her. Recognizing the delicate balance between advocacy, personal recovery, and privacy, Psychologists and criminologists analyzed Jonathan's behavior extensively, using the case as a study in obsessive personality traits, narcissistic tendencies, and the mechanisms by which ordinary individuals can escalate to extreme, premeditated acts of violence within intimate relationships, generating scholarly articles, media coverage, and public dialogue about risk factors and preventative measures. Emily herself became an advocate, speaking on panels, engaging in educational programs, and collaborating with organizations focused on domestic abuse prevention and survivor support, transforming her harrowing experience into a platform for awareness, empathy, and empowerment, emphasizing that survival is not just about enduring, but about reclaiming agency and preventing others from facing similar dangers. Legally, the case set precedents in terms of evidentiary documentation, forensic investigation, and the interpretation of psychological profiling in domestic violence contexts, providing law enforcement, prosecutors, and defense teams with important lessons in handling complex, premeditated crimes that blur the lines between private and public life, obsession, and criminality. Emily's own reflections revealed a nuanced journey from victimhood to empowerment, recognizing that her courage, memory, and resilience were central to ensuring justice, and that confronting the past was necessary to regain control over the future. Each day of therapy, community engagement, and personal reflection contributed to rebuilding identity, trust, and a sense of safety. Jonathan, confined to his cell, faced the stark reality of accountability, the loss of freedom, and the exposure of his calculated obsession to the world. Forced to confront not only the legal consequences of his actions, but the enduring social, psychological, and moral judgment that would define his legacy as a man who nearly destroyed a life for reasons rooted in envy, control, and delusion. The aftermath also highlighted the role of media and public scrutiny in shaping narratives around domestic violence, survival, and accountability, illustrating how collective attention can reinforce justice, amplify survivor voices, and create societal awareness that serves both preventive and educational functions, ensuring that lessons from such crimes are not forgotten. Ultimately, Emily's recovery and advocacy, combined with Jonathan's conviction, reflected a profound contrast between human resilience and calculated malice, underscoring that even in the darkest circumstances, survival, courage, and truth have the power to triumph, inspire, and reshape communities' laws and social consciousness. The chapter closed with Emily stepping out into the light of a new day. Physically scarred but mentally resolute, her survival transformed into purpose, her voice amplified in support of others, and the shadow of Jonathan Hartwell's calculated violence finally confronted and constrained, leaving a legacy of awareness, justice, and the enduring power of human strength in the face of unimaginable adversity.